The moment hung in the air like a poorly lit photograph. A fist moving forward, air compressed in the narrow corridor, the dull sound of an impact that hadn't happened yet. There were too many eyes in that room for anyone to truly see. No one noticed the detail that mattered, a minimal gesture, almost invisible, made by the one who seemed to have no choice at all. The promise was sealed. Something irreversible was going to happen. Not there, not in that second, but from that moment on. Jack was on his knees, not in submission, by calculation. The cold floor bit through the worn fabric, and the smell of rust mixed with cheap detergent made the air feel heavy. His head stayed slightly lowered, just enough to avoid meeting anyone's eyes. In that place, the posture made sense. Looking smaller kept the body intact. What didn't make sense was the calm. Not the empty calm of someone who had given up, but the calm of someone who had already measured the space, counted the steps, and memorized the exits. Briggs stood at the center like a stage. Broad frame, dense tattoos, the kind of presence that pushed silence against the walls. He smiled with clenched teeth, a smile that didn't ask permission. In there, Briggs was an unwritten rule. He didn't need to raise his voice. One step forward was enough for the room to comply. Two men behind him laughed without humor, trained laughter, the kind an audience learns to repeat. "Look at him," Briggs said, short, like he was pointing at an object. Jack didn't look. The dorm felt smaller when Briggs moved closer. Metal bunk beds lined up, sheets folded in haste, walls scarred with old marks. A clock at the back showed an imprecise time, months out of sync. The place taught quickly. Time in there didn't obey the outside world. The inside world followed different rules, improvised hierarchies and silent punishments. Jack hadn't been there long enough to be new enough to be chosen. He carried a past no one asked about and a face that didn't invite conversation. Broad shoulders, muscle contained beneath a plain shirt, old scars that went unnoticed because they were in the right places to be ignored. To anyone watching from a distance, Jack was just another guy. To Briggs, he was an invitation. "On your knees looks better," Briggs murmured, almost kindly. Jack shifted his weight, carefully setting his knee. That was when the detail happened. A brief movement of the left hand, like someone brushing dust off the floor. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't defense. It was a signal, discreet enough to be mistaken for nothing. Eli, leaning in the shadows near the water fountain, saw it. He didn't react. He simply looked away for half a second, as if marking a point on an invisible map. No one else noticed. No one needed to. The dorm's sounds continued unchanged, metal creaking, footsteps, breathing. Briggs raised his arm. His fist hovered inches from Jack's face. There was no rush. A spectacle requires pause. The other men edged closer, curious, comfortable in the certainty that the outcome was already known. In that system, outcomes were predictable. "You came in thinking you were someone," Briggs said. Jack stayed silent. The silence was unsettling. Briggs frowned, not out of doubt but frustration. The script demanded a reaction, fear, begging. Jack's quiet delivered none of it. It was a heavy, organized silence, as if it were holding space. Authority wasn't inside the room, but it was close enough to hear if it chose to. Captain Harris passed the outer corridor at that hour almost every day. It wasn't a coincidence. He knew the rhythm, knew when the noise peaked. Harris didn't intervene without reason. He watched. He had learned that control sometimes came from letting things happen. Briggs's fist moved 1 inch closer. Jack's face didn't shift. The muscles in his neck stayed loose. It was strange. People tense up when they're about to be hit. Jack didn't. He simply breathed. "Say something," Briggs taunted. "Or you don't talk." Jack lifted his gaze for the first time, not at Briggs, but at the space behind him. Just a second, long enough to measure distance, long enough to confirm presence. Eli remained still. The detail was confirmed. The fist pulled back. Briggs wanted to stretch the moment. For him, power came from delay, from controlling the timing. He smiled again, wider now, confident. In that place, confidence was a strong currency. "You'll learn fast," Briggs said. "In here you learn fast." Jack nodded once, minimal. The gesture was taken as agreement. It wasn't. It was documentation. The impact didn't happen. Not yet. Briggs lowered his arm, but not to strike. He chose the warning. He chose the promise. That promise hung in the air, more threatening than the punch itself. The laughter faded. The scene began to lose momentum. Briggs didn't like that. The clock at the back advanced 1 minute. Harris passed the corridor. His steps paused for an instant. The sound inside the dorm dropped, as if the room had learned to adjust. Harris didn't enter. He didn't need to. Jack lowered his head again. The image was complete for anyone content with surface appearances. A man on his knees, a leader standing, a system functioning. The detail, ignored by everyone, remained exactly where it was. Jack's left hand, now relaxed, thumb pressing against the invisible ring of his finger. An old habit, a silent reminder, nothing was over. It had just begun. The world inside that wing was easy to understand and hard to endure. The rules weren't written anywhere, but they were enforced with precision. Whoever spoke the loudest decided. Whoever took up space ruled. Whoever watched in silence learned how to survive. The system didn't favor the fair or the strong. It favored the predictable. And Briggs was predictable in the most dangerous way possible. The wing worked like an old machine that creaked but never stopped. Rigid schedules, silent lines, eyes that avoided lingering too long. The concrete absorbed everything. Footsteps, voices, small conflicts that never made it into reports. Violence didn't need to be constant there. It only needed to be possible. That possibility kept everyone in line. Briggs understood this better than anyone, not because he was smart in the traditional sense, but because he had instinct. He knew who could be pressured and who would fold without much effort. He didn't need to strike every time. Sometimes just getting close was enough. He moved like the place belonged to him, spreading a kind of toxic confidence, filling corridors as if they were extensions of his own body. "New guy," he said later, crossing paths with Jack near the metal tables in the mess hall. Jack didn't answer. Silence became a habit quickly. Jack spoke little because he didn't need to speak. He always sat in the same place, ate at the same pace, stood up at the same signal. To casual observers, it looked like resignation. To anyone who understood patterns, it was discipline. He never rushed, never reacted, never showed discomfort beyond what was necessary to appear human. The environment worked in Briggs's favor. The other inmates knew the system didn't punish those who maintained the informal order. As long as there was no visible blood, everything was treated as an internal adjustment. That created a perfect stage for small humiliations. A shove here, a comment there, a tray knocked to the floor on purpose. Always in public, always with enough witnesses to spread the message. "You take up too much space," Briggs said during one of those moments, knocking Jack's tray aside with his forearm. Jack picked up the fallen plate without hurry. Authority rarely appeared directly. Captain Harris preferred to watch from a distance, tall, rigid posture, the tired look of someone who had seen every cycle repeat itself. He knew who Briggs was. He also knew that intervening too early only changed the method, not the problem. Harris watched because he had learned that real control came from information, and information was exactly what Jack seemed to be gathering in silence. Eli, the quiet ally, stayed on the edges, never in the center, never laughing too loudly, never reacting to provocation. He watched Jack with contained attention, like someone recognizing something familiar without being able to name it. Sometimes their eyes met for a second. Nothing was said, nothing needed to be. Briggs kept testing small remarks, loose phrases, spoken just loudly enough to be heard. Some people come in thinking they'll last. In here, everyone learns. Jack didn't react, not because he didn't feel it, but because he understood the game. Reacting too early shifted the focus. The system thrived on predictable responses. Jack offered none. The wing began to adjust its gaze. Some inmates were unsettled by the lack of reaction. Others waited for the inevitable collapse. No one believed someone like Jack could hold out for long. The internal logic said he would either break or be broken. Briggs noticed the murmuring before anyone else. His authority depended on silent consensus. As long as everyone believed, he ruled. But beliefs are fragile when something slips off script. Jack's silence was starting to look like choice, not fear. "You think you're invisible," Briggs said one morning, standing too close. Jack lifted his eyes for an instant, just one. "No." The word was short, simple. It explained nothing, but it didn't apologize. The air shifted slightly. Briggs felt it. He couldn't explain why, but he felt it, like something moving out of place without making a sound. Harris watched from the other side of the inner yard. Weak sunlight, long shadows stretching across cracked ground. He mentally marked the moment. Not the word, the effect. The environment responded with a strange, uncomfortable quiet. Jack lowered his gaze again. The world kept turning, but something had been registered, not in reports, not on cameras, but in the kind of memory that changes collective behavior. The system still favored Briggs. The appearance was still one of absolute control. Jack was still seen as weak, but the machine had begun to creak differently. Not from wear, but from misalignment. The provocations stopped being accidental. They gained timing, an audience, and intent. Briggs was no longer testing limits. He was staking territory. The problem was that the territory no longer responded the same way. The environment remained oppressive, but the air carried a strange anticipation, as if something were overdue. In the inner yard, Briggs chose the moment carefully. He waited for the group to form, for the low chatter to rise. Jack walked straight ahead, always alone, always at the same pace. He didn't look to either side. He didn't need to. He knew when he would be intercepted. "Hey!" Briggs said, loud enough to echo off the walls. Jack stopped. The pause was brief but deliberate. He turned only his torso, not his whole body. A subtle choice, not confrontation, not submission. An economy of movement. Briggs stepped forward twice, invading personal space with practiced ease. "You think you can pretend I don't exist?" Jack kept his eyes fixed just below Briggs's chin. "No." The word came out flat. A few laughed, short, uneasy laughs. Others stayed quiet. Briggs felt the weight of the collective gaze. He needed to reassert himself. He shoved Jack with his shoulder, not hard enough to be seen. Jack took a step back and rebalanced without stumbling. No reaction, no visible tension, just adjustment. "You learn fast," Briggs repeated, this time with less confidence. Jack said nothing. The small humiliations became routine. Briggs dropped comments as Jack passed, knocked objects over near him, changed routes on purpose to force encounters. There were always witnesses. There was always silence afterward. "Some men like to play statue," Briggs said once, laughing alone, "until someone pushes." Jack continued not to react. That was what bothered him most. The lack of response was starting to feel like provocation, not an open one, but the worst kind, the kind that doesn't acknowledge the other as a threat. Eli watched everything, never interfered, never commented. He was simply present. Sometimes he shifted position discreetly. Sometimes he disappeared for a few minutes and came back. Briggs didn't notice. He had no reason to. Authority watched too. Harris began varying his schedule, appearing in places he normally didn't. He said nothing, interrupted nothing. He was just there. The effect was subtle, but it existed. Briggs felt it, even if he couldn't explain it, like the ground wasn't quite as solid as before. One late afternoon, in the narrow corridor between cells, Briggs decided to increase the pressure. There weren't many people around. The echo made everything sharper. He pinned Jack against the wall with his forearm, pressing without overt violence. "Are you deaf, or do you just like pretending?" Jack took a slow breath. He didn't look away. "I like choosing." The line landed wrong. It wasn't a direct challenge. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement. The corridor fell silent. Briggs felt his stomach tighten. That wasn't in the script. He pulled back a fraction of an inch, almost imperceptible, and covered it with a forced smile. "Choosing what?" Jack didn't answer. The silence stretched too long. Briggs dropped his arm and stepped back, feigning disinterest. But the damage was done. A few inmates, the more attentive ones, had seen it, had felt it. They couldn't explain it, but something didn't add up. The provocations continued, but they lost precision. Briggs missed the tone. Sometimes he overdid it. Sometimes he backed off too soon. Jack remained the same, present, invisible, untouchable in a strange way. "He doesn't feel it," someone muttered one night. "Or he feels too much," another replied. Jack moved through the dorm as if the space were neutral, as if no one had power over him. That didn't go unnoticed. The system depended on recognition. Briggs needed to be seen as a threat. Jack didn't see him that way. In a moment that seemed trivial, Briggs lost control. He stepped in too close, too fast, shoving Jack with visible force. The impact was sharp. Jack's body moved, but he didn't fall. He absorbed it and returned to his original stance. No reaction. "React," Briggs whispered, irritated. Jack tilted his head, almost curious. "No." The word sounded different this time. Firmer, clearer. The environment answered with a heavy silence. No one laughed. No one commented. Briggs realized too late that he was losing something he couldn't quite name. Harris watched from the other side of the yard. For the first time, he wrote Jack's name in an old notebook, not because of the shove, but because of the collective reaction. The system was beginning to recalibrate its own weight. Jack kept walking. The conflict hadn't exploded. Not yet, but it was alive, growing, fed by every frustrated attempt Briggs made to reassert a power that was starting to feel performative. Jack's patience wasn't passive, it was strategic, and the environment was beginning to sense it, even if it didn't yet understand why. The looks began to change before any words did. Nothing declared, nothing openly acknowledged. It was subtle, a laugh that came a beat late. A path quietly avoided, a silence that lingered half a second longer than usual. Small adjustments that, taken together, revealed a system trying to recalibrate itself. Jack started being talked about when he wasn't around. His name surfaced in short whispers, always unfinished. No one asked where he came from. No one risked guessing too much. Mystery worked better without edges. The unknown kept its distance. "He doesn't react," someone said, too close for Briggs to hear. "Or he doesn't need to," another replied, too quickly to be challenged. Eli stayed exactly where he had always been, but now he was noticed, not because he was doing anything new, but because he had never done anything at all. His constant presence began to feel intentional. Sometimes he appeared near Jack at the most tense moments. Other times he vanished when Briggs showed up. Enough coincidence to avoid direct suspicion. Enough structure to make people uneasy. The authority figure changed as well. Harris started moving more slowly. He watched groups instead of individuals, wrote down fewer names and more patterns. He didn't intervene, but his presence altered the overall volume. Briggs noticed. He didn't like it. His control depended on institutional absence. The more official eyes around, the less room there was for aggressive improvisation. Briggs tried to regain ground through narrative, scattered comments, exaggerated stories, insinuations about Jack. None of it stuck. The story couldn't hold because Jack didn't cooperate. He didn't react. He didn't deny. He didn't confirm. The silence broke the cycle. "He thinks he's better than everyone," Briggs said one morning. No one answered. That was the first real sign of discomfort. Briggs was used to automatic responses, laughter, agreement, echoes. The absence of them left him exposed. He started miscalculating. Pressure began to sound like anxiety. Jack felt the shift. He didn't celebrate it. Didn't change his behavior. He simply kept his pace. Power, when it starts to move, exposes those who try to grip it too tightly. He knew that. He'd seen it before, in other places, under other names. The environment watched Jack from a distance, not with admiration, but with cautious curiosity. It was too early to pick sides. Systems always wait for a winner before aligning. Until then, they observe. Eli spoke at last, not to Jack, not to anyone in particular. A loose sentence, low, near the metal table. Some men only fall when they realize too late. The line circulated, not as a rumor but as a feeling. Briggs heard it from afar. He didn't catch the context. He felt the weight. Harris noticed the same thing. He began cross-checking old information, cases, transfers, behavior patterns. Jack's name didn't appear where it should have. Records were missing. Gaps too small to be administrative error. Harris didn't draw conclusions. He stored the detail. Late one quiet afternoon, Jack stopped near the water fountain. Briggs was on the other side of the yard, surrounded by fewer people than before. The looks weren't the same. Jack didn't look at him. He didn't need to. "He's waiting," someone murmured. "Who?" "No one." That was the new complexity. There was no clear event, no confrontation, just the collective sense that something was being prepared beyond immediate reach. Briggs felt the ground less stable, but he still believed he was in charge. The system still responded to his name. Still, on the surface, Jack remained invisible. Beneath it, the environment had already begun reorganizing its priorities, not around declared leadership, but around silent coherence. People gravitate toward what doesn't demand explanation. Authority watched. The quiet ally remained. The antagonist kept pushing. And the protagonist, still seen as weak by those who needed to believe that, was beginning to occupy space without taking up any space at all. The question was no longer whether Briggs would make a mistake. It was when he would realize he already had. Something changed without announcing its arrival. It wasn't a visible event or a grand gesture. It was internal. First in Jack, then in the environment. Like a shift in pressure that goes unnoticed until the body responds. Jack woke up that morning with a clear sense that time had adjusted itself, no longer against him, not in his favor either, just aligned. He kept his routine, folded the sheet the same way, laced his worn shoes with the same care. The difference was in his gaze, no longer lowered, no longer avoided, neutral. The kind of neutrality that doesn't ask permission. Briggs felt it before he saw it. A diffuse discomfort, irritation without a clear target. He tried to dismiss it. Fatigue, increased oversight, nothing more. But the unease lingered. The environment seemed to be watching him back. Not with fear, with expectation. In the yard, groups formed as usual, but the spacing was different. Briggs noticed he had to walk farther to be noticed. Laughter took longer to come. Responses felt clipped. He decided to act. "You," he said, pointing at Jack, short and sharp. Jack stopped. Briggs approached with firm steps, trying to reclaim the old rhythm. He got too close. The move usually worked. Jack didn't step back, didn't step forward. He simply stayed. "You think something's changed here?" Briggs asked, low and threatening. Jack looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. There was no challenge in his eyes. There was assessment. "It has." One word. Nothing more. The air around them seemed to lose density. Briggs felt a brief chill in his stomach. He didn't know why. He tried to laugh, but the sound came out wrong. "You don't run this place," Jack answered without raising his voice. "I know." The response disarmed the confrontation. Briggs had expected denial, expected defiance. That short agreement left him unsteady. His power had always relied on opposition. Without it, only the gesture remained. "Then stay in your place," Briggs said, louder than he intended. Jack tilted his head a fraction. "I always have." The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was recalibration. The environment registered the exchange as a marker. There was no applause, no murmuring, just a diffuse understanding that a line had been crossed. Eli watched from the shadows, unmoving. Harris, in the outer corridor, paused longer than usual. He didn't hear the words. He didn't need to. The effect was visible. Briggs tried to regain control through physical proximity. He stepped closer, invaded space. Jack didn't move. The lack of reaction wasn't passivity. It was refusal to play. "You're messing with me," Briggs said quietly, almost pleading for confirmation. Jack replied with the shortest line yet. "No." The word landed like a seal. Briggs took a step back without realizing it. He compensated with a sharp gesture, turning toward the others, searching for support. He found none. The turning point wasn't what Jack said. It was what he didn't say afterward. He didn't explain, didn't provoke, didn't threaten. He let the void do the work. From that moment on, Briggs began to feel the looks, not as allies, as evaluators. Every sentence he spoke felt too heavy. Every attempt at dominance sounded rehearsed. Performative power fails when the audience changes its expectations. Jack went through the day as always, ate, walked, sat, but something in him was different. He no longer needed to appear smaller, no longer needed to hide. The change was internal, but it leaked outward. The environment noticed. Harris wrote a short line in his notebook. The shift occurred. He didn't write names. He didn't need to. That night, the dorm was quieter. Briggs didn't circulate. He stayed in his own space, watching. Jack passed by without looking at him. It wasn't contempt. It was irrelevance. The turning point had been psychological. No physical confrontation. No direct threat. Just a brief exchange that altered the collective reading. Systems recognize signals when they are clear. And Jack had been clear. The consequences didn't arrive as an explosion. They came as slow adjustments, almost administrative. The environment began responding without announcing that it was responding. Small choices shifted. People sat in different places. Paths were rerouted. The gravitational center of the wing began to move. Briggs felt it the very next day. He tried to reclaim the old rhythm, circulating like before, occupying space with his body. The space didn't open. Some people stepped aside too late, others didn't step aside at all. The discomfort grew. "What's wrong?" Briggs said loudly, expecting an echo. There wasn't one. The lack of response weighed more than any provocation. He started using his voice more often. Aggression increased, the tone sharpened. It was a familiar mistake. When power slips, volume becomes the substitute. Jack remained the same. He didn't seek attention. He didn't isolate himself. He simply existed in the space naturally. That changed everything. Effortless presence began to look like leadership. "He doesn't move," someone murmured. "He doesn't have to," came the automatic reply. Eli was seen near Jack more often. They didn't talk. They didn't exchange visible signals, but the proximity communicated something no one dared define. Briggs realized too late that he no longer controlled the collective interpretation. Harris intensified his observation. He intervened less and appeared more. Institutional authority drifted closer to equilibrium. Not to protect anyone, but to understand who was actually setting the tempo. Briggs tried a different approach. Less exposure, more insinuation, lowered voice, almost confidential. "Be careful who you associate with," he said to Jack in an empty corridor. Jack replied without turning his head. "I always am." The line wasn't a threat. It was a statement. Briggs felt his stomach twist. His aggression began to look like desperation. The environment took note. Other inmates started responding differently to Briggs's informal orders. They delayed, questioned with their eyes. Sometimes they simply ignored him. Power that depends on tacit obedience dies the moment it needs explanation. "You heard what I said," Briggs insisted once. "I heard," someone replied, and did nothing. Jack didn't benefit directly. He didn't ask for favors. He didn't issue orders. That made everything clearer. He didn't need to command, to influence. The system was adjusting itself around him. The most visible change appeared in body language. People stopped looking to Briggs before acting. They began scanning the environment instead. They began glancing toward Jack, not for permission, for silent confirmation of stability. Harris noticed the precise moment the shift completed. It wasn't a line of dialogue. It was a cue reorganizing without Briggs at the center. A table occupied without consultation. Small scenes that together redefine hierarchy. Briggs made one last attempt to reclaim the stage. He raised his voice in the yard, accused Jack of vague things, offered no proof. The effect was the opposite of what he expected. The silence was uncomfortable. No one moved. Jack lifted his eyes for a second. He didn't speak. The gesture was enough. Briggs cut himself off mid-sentence, confused. The moment passed. The power did not return. The consequences were now clear. Briggs still existed, but he no longer ruled. Jack still didn't rule, but he controlled the rhythm. Systems favor predictability, and Jack offered it without demanding anything in return. Briggs's aggression became less confident, more erratic. Every attempt to regain control only highlighted the loss. The environment, like a living organism, rejected excess. Jack remained silent. This time, the silence worked in his favor. Jack's growth wasn't announced. There was no grand gesture, no abrupt change in behavior. It was a growth noticed by others first, long before he bothered to acknowledge it himself. The environment began lowering its volume around him, as if his presence required less noise to function. Jack started being noticed without being watched. People registered his arrival and kept doing what they were doing, but with less urgency, less anxiety. The general feeling was one of stability, not comfort. Stability. Something rare in that place. Briggs, on the other hand, started being watched whenever he spoke. Every word seemed to ask for validation. Every movement felt rehearsed. He still occupied physical space, but he no longer controlled the atmosphere. Power had shifted to something less visible. Jack walked the corridors with the same posture as before, but the looks that followed him had changed. There was no challenge in them. There was calculation. People wanted to understand. They wanted to know what to expect. Systems always seek predictability. "He doesn't move," someone said quietly. "He decides when," another replied. Eli maintained the exact distance. He didn't get closer than necessary. He didn't pull away. The silent proximity became a signal, not of declared alliance, but of alignment. Those who noticed understood. Those who didn't still felt it. Harris began receiving fewer confusing reports, not because anything had formally improved, but because the environment was more contained, fewer small conflicts, less noise. He knew how to read that. Someone was regulating the rhythm without appearing in the records. Jack didn't seek interaction, but when someone spoke to him, the tone changed. Sentences grew shorter, volume dropped, not out of fear, but out of unspoken respect. "All good?" an inmate asked one morning without any real reason. Jack nodded. "Yeah." The simple response had an immediate effect. The man walked away with relaxed shoulders. Small exchanges like that began to repeat themselves. The environment learned quickly. Briggs realized too late that Jack didn't need to win anyone over. People adjusted because it worked better that way. Real power rarely asks for attention. It organizes. Jack's growth became undeniable when the provocations stopped. Not because anyone forbade them, but because they no longer produced results. Briggs tried one last ironic remark, a loose comment. "Now everyone's watching you," he said, bitter. Jack replied without looking at him. "They always were." The line wasn't provocation, it was truth. The silence that followed was long. Briggs walked away without a response. The gesture was seen by many, registered by all. Jack began occupying central spaces without moving toward the center. He sat where he had always sat. The center shifted to him. Tables around him rearranged themselves. Conversations softened when he arrived, not by order, by natural adjustment. Harris observed the final change in a simple scene. A minor conflict formed near the water fountain. Two men argued in low voices. Before Briggs could intervene, they looked toward Jack. He didn't speak. He simply remained. The conflict dissolved. Nothing else needed to be said. Jack had gone from invisible to reference, not in a declared way, in a functional one. The system recognized it. Briggs still believed he was in charge, but he was no longer taken into account. The difference between presence and authority had become clear to everyone. Jack went on with his day as always. But now when he moved, the environment moved with him. The silence gained weight. Not the ordinary silence of routine, but a dense silence, the kind that precedes collective decisions. The environment seemed to hold its breath. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Something was about to be defined. Jack noticed it first through absence. Briggs wasn't where he usually was. He no longer claimed the center of the yard. He didn't roam the corridors with the same frequency. When he did appear, he was watched too closely. The excess attention made him smaller. He still believed he was in charge, but now he had to prove it with visible effort. Systems don't like visible effort. They prefer flow. Harris sensed the same thing through informal reports. Less noise didn't mean peace. It meant anticipation. He began overlapping shifts, showing up outside the usual pattern. Not to stop anything, to be present when it became necessary. Eli adjusted his own rhythm. He moved with more precision, less improvisation. He didn't speak to Jack, but stayed close enough to be seen. The message was clear to anyone who knew how to read it. The balance was being maintained. Jack kept his routine. He didn't speed up, he didn't slow down. His preparation wasn't physical, it was environmental. He watched who looked at whom, who waited for reactions, who avoided conflict. The climax wouldn't be a single event, it would be the final recognition of something that had already happened. The dorm felt different at night. Lower voices, contained laughter. Briggs tried to reclaim control through forced presence, sitting where he normally wouldn't. The effect was immediate and negative. People shifted a few inches away, enough to be noticed. "Have you forgotten who I am?" he said, louder than necessary. No one answered. Jack didn't look. He didn't need to. The silence answered for him. Collective expectation began to organize itself, not like a crowd rooting, but like a calculation. The system needed a resolution to function predictably again. Briggs still believed he could impose that resolution. Jack knew he didn't have to. The moment approached without a date. Like a cold front arriving before it's announced, the environment adjusted its behavior to absorb the impact. Harris chose a longer shift that night, not by intuition, by experience. Changes like this always sought a final scene, not necessarily violent, definitive. Jack walked across the yard under weak light. A few eyes followed him. They weren't asking for action. They were waiting for confirmation. He didn't give it. Eli stopped near the exit, arms crossed, watching. Briggs appeared on the opposite side, alone. The solitude was new to him. He tried to mask it with rigid posture. "The game's over," Briggs said, in a tone that searched for authority. Jack stopped, turned slowly. It never was. The response was brief. The air seemed to compress. There were no shouts, no sudden movements, just understanding. The climax was approaching because the antagonist still believed he was in control. That belief needed to collide with reality. The system required it to move forward. The silence became absolute. The next move wouldn't be force, it would be recognition. The confrontation didn't begin with a step forward. It began with Briggs's late realization that there was no audience. The yard was occupied, but no one positioned themselves at his side. There was no expectation of a spectacle. There was anticipation of closure. Briggs moved anyway, not out of courage, out of habit. He needed the gesture to remind himself of who he believed he was. He stopped a few steps from Jack, close enough to intrude, far enough to avoid control. "You think you've won," Briggs said, forcing steadiness into his voice. Jack took a moment to measure the distance between them. No, the word wasn't denial. It was correction. Briggs felt the difference too late. "Then what is this?" he pressed, spreading his arms as if calling the space itself to witness. Jack answered with the shortest, most definitive line he had spoken so far. "Delay." The silence that followed was absolute, not because anyone demanded it, but because there was nothing left to add. Briggs scanned the yard, searching for a reaction. He found none. The space no longer reflected him. That was when the revelation arrived, not as a speech, but as alignment. Harris appeared at the edge of the area, flanked by 2 officers. There was no announcement, just presence. He looked at Briggs, then at Jack. His expression held no surprise, only confirmation. "Everything under control?" Harris asked, neutral. Jack answered without looking at him. "It always was." The line explained nothing. It didn't need to. Harris nodded once, a minimal administrative gesture. In that instant, Briggs understood what he had lost, long before he acted. Not physical control, institutional recognition. "You can't just—" Briggs began. Harris cut him off, flat. "Lower your voice." The command wasn't directed at Jack. Briggs swallowed hard. For the first time, his tone was adjusted by someone who didn't fear his reaction. The system had spoken. Eli stepped closer, not to support, to close the space. Briggs noticed the movement in his peripheral vision and understood. The climax didn't require force, it required acceptance. "You knew," Briggs said, looking at Jack now, his voice lower. Jack answered with simple honesty. "From the start." "Do." The late revelation wasn't about past credentials, titles, or hidden stories. It was about reading the environment. Jack never needed to prove anything because he never tried to. He was power precisely because he didn't need to use it. Harris gave the order with the ease of someone who had already decided. "Briggs, come with us." There was no resistance, no scene. Briggs took one last look around. The yard didn't respond. The system had changed hands before that sentence was spoken. Jack stayed where he was. He didn't celebrate. He didn't react. The climax had been psychological. The real confrontation had happened weeks earlier, in silence. As Briggs was led away, the environment breathed, not in relief, in alignment. The machine began turning again without friction. Jack turned and walked on. His power didn't need to be displayed. It had already been recognized. The system's response was immediate and silent, as it always is when change has been preparing itself for a long time. There were no announcements, no collective explanations. The space simply reorganized. Routines continued, but at a different cadence. The noise dropped. Small tensions stopped piling up. Briggs was removed from the center of the mechanism like a part taken out without sound. His absence didn't create a vacuum. It created flow. Tables were occupied again without dispute. Corridors no longer required anticipatory detours. Power that depends on constant presence reveals its fragility when it disappears without leaving a trace. Harris formalized what had already been decided. Records were updated, shifts adjusted, observations closed. For the system, it was just a course correction. For those living inside it, it was a return to predictability, the kind of justice that isn't announced but felt. Jack stayed exactly where he had always been. He received no special treatment, sought no privilege. The difference was in how the environment behaved around him. People no longer wondered whether something might happen. They knew it wouldn't, unless it was necessary. Eli maintained the same discreet posture. There was no celebration, only a tacit understanding that balance had been restored. The silent alliance had fulfilled its role without leaving marks. Institutional authority began circulating less often. When an environment self-regulates, formal control steps back. Harris understood that. He observed one last time before reducing his presence. The system was stable. Jack didn't assume any official position. He didn't need to. Real power doesn't occupy chairs. It regulates movement. And that had already been done. What changed hands wasn't strength or visible leadership. It was environmental awareness, the ability to define what was necessary and what was excess. The system responded to that with precision. When someone new arrived days later, no one explained anything. There were no warnings, only clear behavior. The environment taught on its own. Jack continued his routine, folded his sheet, walked the same corridors, ate at the same time. But now, when he passed, the space adjusted effortlessly. Silent justice had been established. Nothing needed to be said. At the end of the day, Jack paused for a moment at the same spot where everything had begun. The corridor was clean, the air lighter. No one occupied the center. No one needed to. He caught his faint reflection in the worn metal and moved on without hurry. Eli passed by him, exchanged a brief look. Nothing was said. There was nothing left to confirm. On the other side, Harris closed a simple report and put the notebook away. The shift ended without incident. The system had found a new axis. Jack walked back to his cell, sat down, breathed. Balance didn't require constant vigilance. Only continuity. Power remained where it had always been, invisible, functional, silent. If you made it this far, it's because you noticed something many people would have missed from the very beginning. This wasn't a story about brute force or who shouts the loudest. It was about reading the environment, patience, and the kind of power that only reveals itself when it's already too late for the one who underestimated it. If you understood when everything truly changed, long before the final confrontation, comment, "I stayed till the end," below. That tells me who actually followed every detail. And if you enjoy stories with psychological tension, silent twists, and smart endings, subscribe to the channel. The next stories will demand even more attention.